Lemuel Gulliver awoke to the peculiar sensation of being unable to move. His arms and legs were pinned, his head immobilized, and even his hair seemed to have been anchored down. At first, he thought it must be the remnants of his shipwreck ordeal, the weight of debris perhaps, but as his eyes adjusted to the blinding sunlight, he realized the truth was far stranger. Around him scurried hundreds of tiny people, no taller than 6 inches. They carried ropes, ladders, and spears no larger than sewing needles. Some were running across his body as if he were a landscape, while others stood at a safe distance, shouting commands in a language Gulliver couldn't understand. It took a moment for the sheer absurdity of the situation to sink in. Here he was, a grown man tied down by creatures so small they could fit in the palm of his hand. His initial instinct was to struggle, but the moment he so much as flexed his muscles, a volley of tiny arrows rained down on him. They didn't cause real harm, more like a swarm of stinging insects, but it was enough to make him freeze. He realized that to these people, he must appear a giant, a potential monster, and any sudden movement could incite panic. Calming himself, Gulliver decided to observe. The tiny figures were remarkably organized, working together with precision as they tightened the ropes across his chest and limbs. A small platform had been constructed near his head, where a particularly elaborately dressed man was shouting what seemed to be orders. Gulliver guessed this was their leader, perhaps even their king. Hoping to demonstrate he was not a threat, Gulliver smiled faintly and nodded, which caused a flurry of excitement among the tiny people. The elaborately dressed man gestured, and a contingent of them approached with what appeared to be tiny barrels and loaves of bread, offering them to Gulliver as food. Gulliver realized the offering was a gesture of goodwill. Though the tiny barrels of wine and pebble-sized loaves did little to satisfy his hunger, he accepted them gratefully, taking exaggerated care to eat and drink without alarming his captors. His deliberate gentleness seemed to reassure them, and the crowd cheered as the leader raised his hands in a triumphant gesture. This strange interaction was only the beginning of Gulliver's journey in Lilliput. As the hours passed, Gulliver was carried into the Lilliputian capital by an army of tiny horses and an ingenious pulley system. The Lilliputians, despite their size, were extraordinary engineers. They hauled Gulliver's enormous frame on a wooden platform, inching their way toward the city with determination and teamwork. As they traveled, Gulliver marveled at the intricate farmland and quaint villages dotting the landscape. Everything was perfectly proportioned to the Lilliputians, from their houses with minuscule thatched roofs to their tiny livestock grazing in the fields. When they reached the city, Gulliver was astonished. The architecture was exquisite, with colorful buildings no taller than his knees, each adorned with intricate carvings and decorations. The streets were filled with Lilliputians who had gathered to gawk at their man mountain. Children perched on rooftops, waving tiny flags, while merchants abandoned their stalls to join the crowd. Gulliver was placed in a courtyard near the royal palace, his arms and legs still bound, though the Lilliputians now seemed less fearful. The king himself emerged from the palace, accompanied by a retinue of advisors and guards. He approached Gulliver with cautious dignity, speaking in the same strange language Gulliver had heard earlier. Though Gulliver couldn't understand the king's words, he recognized the regal bearing and the gestures of welcome. He bowed his head slightly in response, an act that seemed to please the Lilliputians immensely. Over the next few days, they began teaching Gulliver their language, and his quick mastery of it delighted them. Through their conversations, he learned that the island was called Lilliput and that its people had a rich culture and complex political system. Gulliver's size, initially seen as a threat, soon proved to be an asset. When a fire broke out in the royal palace one night, the Lilliputians were helpless to contain it. Gulliver, however, acted swiftly, using his hat to carry water from a nearby river and dousing the flames. This act of heroism solidified his status as a friend to the Lilliputians, and the king officially declared him an ally of the realm. The people began bringing him gifts, tiny chairs, intricately carved trinkets, and garlands of flowers to adorn his fingers. Yet, as Gulliver became more integrated into Lilliputian society, he began to notice the flaws beneath their charming facade. The Lilliputians were as proud and contentious as any people Gulliver had encountered. Their most significant issue was their ongoing war with a neighboring island called Blefuscu. The cause of the conflict? A disagreement over how to crack an egg. According to Lilliputian law, eggs were to be cracked on the smaller end, while the people of Blefuscu insisted on cracking them on the larger end. This seemingly trivial dispute had escalated into a bitter and bloody war that had lasted for generations.